you, and I'm back again as the bad penny. And this man has been maligning me. Don't believe anything of what he says. So I thank you, and just one clarification: he's not Himanshu Jain. He's just Himanshu. And so I just want to clarify. And to me, he's India's finest development economist. Sorry, singling him out for the praise. But he's a columnist at Mint, so biases show. Actually, I just wanted to begin with you because you, I don't know if others, Rajat got an eye into your presentation. You talked of the growth in productivity and the need to do the kind of reforms. I was very curious to ask you that, there is, the kind of reforms you're talking about in a way has already begun, but in a probably, presumably a piecemeal manner. But just wanted to distinguish between when you talk about competition, I know what you're talking about, level playing field. But the issue is, in a level playing field, in crony capitalism, I appreciate your point. But if you have a genuine level playing field, you just assume everyone starts as equal, which in a country like India is so no. So how do you frame your arguments in this Indian context?
Right. Well, that's a great question. I think what we're trying to show is that it's a non-zero-sum world, and so many things that governments do typically that distort their markets, which they do for very good reasons, and often, there's very few distortions that are done. Well, there's some that are done purely to protect powerful interests and crony capitalism, and some, but there are certain things that governments do because they feel that this is the right thing to do. Subsidies will be one area like this. What we're trying to show is that destroys wealth out of the economy, and that there are two, classic economics. You have one policy solution to fix a particular problem, not one policy to fix lots of problems. So what we're trying to show is that there are tremendous gains that can be unlocked from economies if you eliminate these distortions that change. So it's not that you're starting with a level playing field. These are distortions that change the playing field as it is in favor of certain incumbent companies and so forth. So we're trying to show, first of all, that's the losses. Now, what governments do with the gains that come from that kind of non-zero-sum growth, that's a different question. And what we tend to favor, actually, is direct transfer payments to the poor. That actually is the best way of lifting up the poor. But you have to also remember that when markets are undistorted, the entire bell curve of wealth distribution moves to the right. One of the problems that governments tend to have, and this is not just India, this is every government around the world, is that they can bend this bell curve, that they can sort of change the shape of it by policies. And you can only move it really to the right or the left. And many policies that are designed to bend the curve actually end up moving it to the left. And the people who suffer the most is that bottom third, is the bottom half of the curve. So we're very focused on what happens to that group of people. And economic growth in terms of actual competition can lead to tremendous benefits, particularly for them. Distortions, on the other hand, for the rich are a inconvenience. You end up paying a little bit more for food, a little bit more for clothes, a little bit more for these other things. It's inconvenient. For the poor, it's a catastrophe. So that's why we have to focus on distortion.
Go ahead, Wilfred, you want to
Yeah, I also was a little bit sort of struggling with the fact, how do we put that in an Indian context? I think labor laws is probably something that we have to look at in order to make it a little bit easier to do business. Taxes also positive. But if I look at FDI, for example, we have probably one of the more liberal FDI regimes. We've just opened up defense last year, 49%, special cases 74. Now we're moving even to 100% in some cases. So we've been quite proactive. If we look at local content, I'm not sure how many local content regulations we have, at least in the industries that I cover, they're none, right? If I look at MSP, we've just come out of 2 droughts. We've had people dying of thirst in Maharashtra, for example. we've had a downturn in the rural economy because the MSP was actually brought down. I'm not sure how an MSP reduction for the agricultural sector or sort of an abolishment would actually be feasible in this content. I think it would have major social ramifications. And some of the other suggestions also in terms of domestic firms. If you look at how other countries have risen to greatness, Germany rose to greatness by stealing everything they could from the Brits. That's what they did. I mean, Krupp went to Britain, had some drinks with the local community and found out how they make steel, went home and made steel. Right? Then they put made in Sheffield on their products. The products were crappy, they sold them anyway. Right? That is how Germany slowly rose to become an economic power. Japan, no different. Korea, no different. China, no different. We don't like it, but I think that that is, for many economies, actually a way to value creation along the value chain. And I'm not sure if the suggestions would really be beneficial. I mean, in a perfect world, yes. In a realistic world, I'm not 100% sure. If I look at what's happened with Chinese steel, the US put, I forgot the number, some 700% of import duties on Chinese steel. The Chinese are complaining about what we are doing. We actually had a long discussion with the chief minister of steel and told her, you have to protect domestic steel manufacturing. We need to decide what we want to do as a nation, where we want to create wealth. And that's at least, I mean, that's the view of a social marketeer from an Indo-German kind of background.
I'll just get you to respond because I, just on the same refrain, just wanted Himanshu to step in because it's something we always have a conversation about. These distortions which you're talking about may not necessarily be so bad. I mean, even I believe very close to what he's thinking.
Yeah, and I think you more or less kind of pointed out to most of the issues. I mean, the 10 points that you had, and if you compare India with US, in majority of them currently, India is not doing that bad in that sense. But I think what I wanted to kind of bring in, and there are two issues that I want to kind of highlight. And the first issue is obviously about any kind of competition or free market that we are talking about. The issue that is now becoming important everywhere, but also in India, is the issue of inequality in that sense. And that is an issue that is important. And I'll start with a small anecdote, which is, I'm quoting from what Suresh Tendulkar wrote in one of his articles on inequality, that Manmohan Singh, before becoming the finance minister, was in Hong Kong or some East Asian country, and there was the Chinese finance minister was making a presentation. At the end of the presentation, Manmohan Singh got up and asked the question that, won't this lead to rise in inequality? And the answer was, the Chinese finance minister gave the answer was that, I would be surprised if it did not. So it was supposed to lead to rise in inequality. And that is, I think, one where what we have to distinguish between the two kind of inequalities. One, inequalities that arise because of simple functioning of market. I mean, obviously, no one would expect a PhD graduate to get the same job as an illiterate person. So there are some distortions that will come in. But a far more serious problem, and that is where I think the issues of competition gets linked, is the issues of structural inequalities, where caste, gender, religion, place you live, and all that is there. Now, those are issues that no were there in the list of things that are there. But those are issues which are as important as, or for example, when you're talking about Northeast or certain regional places that you're talking about, Kashmir today or anything else, unless you're talking about these structural inequalities and how to overcome these structural inequalities, any idea of a competition or a free economy in that sense is meaningless. Because we are talking about an issue. And that links to the second issue that I think where I don't think you were able to complete your sentence, the presentation in that is the issue related to jobs, the employment problem that we are talking about. 200 million is a dream number. I mean, we have just, the last number that we had was around, we created roughly 2 million jobs per year. Forget about months. So that's what we created in the last, when the economy was growing at 9%. And I mean, that's the best that one can dream of. I mean, and had sustained growth rate. And we are talking about here a big number. And I think that's an issue that is becoming important now in a context where we have Brexit, we have countries in the developed world, OECD worlds are becoming increasingly more and more protective. And every instrument that you're talking about, every instrument is being used in a different way rather than the one that you would like to suggest that we should. And that includes labor rigidity, to protections, to tariffs, to localizations, to everything that you can think of is being done in that sense. But I think the job issue is important, particularly for a big country like India. It was important for also other countries in China and other things. And I'll just quickly take 2 minutes if you permit me. You know, whenever the countries, developing countries, or look at the historic last 300 years of history in that sense, countries move to a very high growth path, suddenly go into an accelerated rate of growth, whether it is the industrial revolution first, industrial revolution second, or whatever. One of the big outcomes that it has is that it is essentially is through a process where labor productivity goes up dramatically. A lot of labor basically is released in the process. I mean, in the sense, labor becomes redundant. I mean, that's how you actually grow. I mean, if your labor productivity is not increasing, productivity growth is not happening, that is not the kind of growth that one is talking about. Because of automation, because of whatever X, Y, Z. And this high unemployment that is created, assuming that the population growth is zero, assume that. Even then it will create an unemployment that is very difficult to deal with. Now, how did countries deal with? And very interesting examples in the entire 300 years. I mean, you can go back also and start from inclusion movements to the Meiji Restoration, to talking about the whole period of colonization where the entire industrial revolution was linked with. The maximum number of people who were exported from these countries which were colonial countries, roughly 50 million people were exported. And that is why they didn't have a problem of unemployment. I mean, the number of white people who moved out to different places, what we call as empty spaces in that sense, was an important part of taking care of that unemployment. Otherwise, that unemployment would have become an unstable issue, created instability in the economy. China did it in different ways. Remember, there are two things that China did in 1979. The one-child policy, and then the hukou system, which is basically creating barrier between people moving from rural areas to urban areas. Because it knew that if it is accelerating that way, the unemployment problem is going to be there. So one was a very stupid attempt of controlling population. And the other was very stupid attempt, because inequalities was going to rise, to basically create artificial barriers between people in the rural and urban areas. Now, democratic countries like India are not going to do any of these. You don't have colonies. You are not going to implement a one-child policy. You're not going to create these barriers as far as these are concerned, nor are you going to have that empty spaces, lands, and those kind of things. This challenge is a big challenge. This is a challenge which is also for demand. You can have as much labor flexibility as you want, but remember, labor flexibility allows you to depress wages. It allows you to take off inefficient labor, bring in more efficient labor. But little bit, exaggeration to say that just because labor flexibility is there, your hiring will go up. Because hiring or your scale of production depends a lot on demand, domestic demand particularly, when international demand is not working. It will depend a lot on your kind of product that you're doing, technology that you're using, various other things. Now remember, on all these things, the challenge that India is facing is very, very difficult. It is not 1980s, when there was one big China. We are now talking about a very difficult situation. You are competing with all of them who are going through. The Brazilians are in the race. The South Africans are in the market. The Chinese are themselves in the market in a big way. How do you tackle these big problems? And that problem is linked to the inequality issue. That is something which is linked to the inequality issue, because the domestic demand is an issue that China is now moving into. In international Brexit, all those things keep in mind. But still, the problem of jobs linked to inequality, the solution lies here. It is very clear, and I'm very sorry to say, none of the 10 there are really in my list of things to do as far as India is concerned. Maybe, and we have already done most of them, but there are other things that the government should be doing.
Shankar, would you like to respond?
Yes, yeah. Yes. So there's a lot there. Just first of all, and in no particular order, in terms of the points that you made about other distortions in other countries that affect India, certainly, absolutely, it's critical that distortions around the world are dealt with. You know, if you are reducing your distortions, and you are allowing, as a result of open trade, for example, you're allowing subsidized Chinese steel to come into your market without any kind of protection. That's a mistake. You know, we saw in the UK, for example, Port Talbot and Redcar, we had at one point 100% unemployment, male unemployment in Redcar So why is that? Because steel from China, and it's not just the subsidy, it's the free land, the free water, it's all kinds of distortions across the board. China is a massively distorted market. And I say to my British friends who are in a trade negotiating mindset now, be careful when you negotiate with China. Because if you think you can get a distortions-free agreement from China, you know, I have a bridge that I can sell you. Every country that has negotiated with China has found itself on the receiving end, including in the WTO, on the receiving end of a very bad deal, which is tariff access on goods, massive distortions in China, and flooding of your market, and a consequent depression of wages and so forth. So I'm not saying that these are things that India should do in a vacuum. I'm absolutely saying that Indian trade policy and international trade policy with respect to other countries should prioritize, because many of these issues that are on our list are issues that affect other countries, that give, you know, mercantilist, protectionist advantage to those countries. And distortions across the board should be eliminated, and you move forward on a gradual basis. We've advocated mechanisms to deal with distortions. The problem with anti-dumping, you mentioned the 700% tariff, this is a disaster for the US economy. But that doesn't mean that steel in China is not being artificially coming in at lower costs, it's being artificially reduced. But we can craft ways of developing tools. The anti-dumping laws are very, they're very damaging to markets around the world. But that doesn't mean you don't protect yourself from distortion. You can protect yourself from distortion by tarifying the distortion. There are ways that this can be done that will actually give the country that's distorting its market an incentive to lower its distortion. The anti-dumping laws don't give that incentive. In fact, they give the incentive to everyone to increase their level of distortion and subsidization, which is bad for the global economy. And one of the reasons that we've not made progress with 20 years without a meaningful multilateral trade agreement, one of the reasons we're in the economic mess, really, that we're in, is because we haven't made any progress on these issues. I was very involved in the privatizations in the former Soviet Union and in Latin America and China WTO accession. And what we saw, and this goes to the reform in India that has occurred so far, is we saw partial reform. And partial reform is really the friend of crony capitalism, because it enables crony interests to open the border, capture the gains of liberalization, and then the gains of liberalization don't flow to people, they don't flow to consumers. So you've got to go to the next step, and you've got to actually engage in, you know, the next level, which is really the structural reforms and the behind-the-border barriers. On copying, yes, it's certainly true that, you know, you can even go to Alexander Hamilton in the US, and you can talk about going to UK textile mills and stealing their stuff. But what's true of that historical arc of economic development is not necessarily true now. What I would say with respect to India and intellectual property is India produces 2 to 3% of the academic research in the world. Very, very high percentage of academic research produced in India doesn't translate into industrial application, partly because of the weakness of intellectual property laws, partly because of very specific kinds of laws. For example, in the US, massive amount of IP companies generated because of the Bayh-Dole Act, which allowed university professors and universities to actually monetize the intellectual property that they were creating. That has created a huge amount of economic activity and job creation. And I would also say, with respect to very specific changes to IP laws can generate industries. So the Diamond versus Chakrabarty decision in the Supreme Court in 1980 in the US essentially protected the patents on bioorganisms. And that created the biotech industry, which has employed hundreds of thousands of people. That industry didn't exist before. So there are whole industries that may be created when you actually lower distortions, when you actually allow competition, because competition is the biggest driver on innovation. You know, because once you have, you have to compete to get the better mousetrap. That's what drives the innovative process, and that's what the record has sort of has shown. And then finally, on inequality, you're absolutely right. Obviously, there's inequality. There's two kinds of inequality. There's inequality caused because people are different, and they're allowed to be free to do whatever they can do and be the best that they can be. That's good. The inequality that arises out of crony capitalism, that arises because a protected incumbent is able to distort the market and therefore protect itself from competition, is very bad. And that is the inequality that we need to be tackling head on, and it exists here, as it does in many countries, but it certainly exists here in large quantities. And therefore, I think it is something that one must address.
I'll just come to you, Wilfred, because I wanted to bring Vivian and Rajat. Vivian, quick thoughts?
So I'm often called Vivian, but I'm Vivan, which is okay because
Apologies.
it's absolutely pardonable because it's a ubiquitous phenomenon with me. But clearly my parents weren't paying attention to the Indian realities when they named me. But I think this, as far as your question on the framework conditions for competing in imperfect markets is concerned, I can only offer a few empirical anecdotes because I work, I run a small policy advocacy and an advisory firm. And we work with a lot of technology companies, but we also work across the spectrum with a few defense companies, a few companies in agriculture. So I'll just give you little snippets from all of these. I think there are three primary factors, in my view, that established the framework conditions for actual competition in an imperfect market. The first is, of course, trust. And there is a complete lack of trust between government and private sector in India, which of course all of us are privy to. This is particularly acute in some sectors more than others. And it's really strange that in sectors such as defense, where on the one hand you have rhetoric around Make in India, on the other hand, you don't have any big orders right now. Today, there are no big orders for the indigenous defense firms, whether it's the large or the small. So this is a curious case of when the government is a consumer and it's also the regulator, and it also does not trust the producer. So this can only be resolved. I mean, this is not an easy question to resolve. There are a lot of things, and I think General Chopra would want to jump in if I was to go into this in any detail. But there are a lot of things within the processes of establishing trust that need to be looked at very seriously through the government lens, through civil society, and otherwise. The second issue is that of better regulation. And because a lot of the FDI that Wilfred and others have talked about is linked to technology today, this is our reality. About half of the FDI is linked to some technology-driven sector, if not the internet. And we just need to figure out a better way to regulate this sector because, and others. And I think here we can take a leaf out of what's happening globally in terms of best practices in regulating the internet itself. What we're learning very quickly in India, whether through discussions around net neutrality or call drops, whatever the case may be, is that neither the executive nor the judiciary are adept or equipped to handle some of these nuanced considerations. I mean, for instance, I'll give you a small instance, which is that of network management, of telecom networks. Nobody understands this in government. Some of them pretend to understand it and have to reach out to professors in Stanford and Columbia, etc., to understand network management through the prism of a technocrat, and then try to determine what regulations should circumscribe that sector, which is, I think, a self-defeating way of doing things. It's probably better to focus on institutional capacity building within government, which means that you need to, again, part of this is related to the trust deficit, because you need to trust the private sector, you need to be able to horizontally absorb people, give them the same kind of incentives that an IS officer or an IFS officer or an IES officer might have, or might avail of. And I think that there the battle in the bureaucracy needs to be fought by a few crusaders from the inside out. And they need to establish a way of integrating private sector inputs, civil society inputs into the regulatory framework. I mean, in telecom, in the judicial process that just concluded recently, it was fairly clear that the judiciary had no idea about how network management practices can affect the quality of service of a telecom operator. How do you, and similarly now we have a diesel, debate going on in the judicial system, wherein you have judges who have never dealt with diesel technology or understood the efficiencies of diesel engines or of so there are many nuanced issues here at play. And how do you integrate private sector inputs into the NGT or into the judiciary or into the parliament? These are important questions that we need to start answering right about now, as we're on the cusp of a very important phase of growth. And I think the third and last issue that I'll touch upon is that of standards. The BIS Act, the Bureau of Indian Standards Act, has recently been amended, and part of that amendment entails, greater vision for standards in the service sector, and also a sort of a new compliance framework, which is still to be drafted out through the rules. But even as this happens, I think it's incumbent upon private sector, particularly large private sector companies, to invest more in their supply chain, to bring everyone up to speed, as far as acceptable standards in their sector are concerned. I think the private sector often ignores this responsibility, whether it's in, and this happens a lot even in the sectors that earn us the most money. I mean, pharmaceuticals, automobiles. We are very proud of these sectors, but I think these sectors are not doing us justice in terms of upgrading the skill set, upgrading the product and service quality to a global standard wherein they can compete in 10 or 15 years. I think they're fooling themselves if they think that this is something that can go on in perpetuity and our competitiveness will remain in our comparative or advantage will remain in the global economy. So I think trust, standards, and private sector inputs into regulation, and civil society, of course, consumer inputs, these are all important factors that perhaps can perfect our imperfect market over time.
Thanks, Vivian. He's making a great point on institutional capacities, of your own experience in TRI. Can you just walk us through this?
Sure. Thanks, Anil. I'm sorry I couldn't hear the presentation, but this has been a great discussion. Before I get to that question, can I just kind of reflect on what has just been said and trying to nuance it by saying that I guess it's a trade-off between the short term and the long term in some sense. In the long term, we would certainly need what Shankar is saying, competitive markets, and that's where institutional capacity comes in, and India is going through those transitions. But as we go through those transitions, I think there will be short-term pain, and Himanshu's reflected on those pains. And I think to add one more dimension to it, so jobs absolutely is going to be a short-term issue that confronts the government and is confronting now increasingly, of course, also state governments, given the competitive federalism, and technology is not helping. But we know that technology will, hopefully create more jobs in the long run as it has happened in the 60s and 80s, but by take an example of ATMs, et cetera. So technology does kind of expand the scope of markets, makes it more efficient, but it's the short-term pain and the short-term transition that is traumatic, and we need to create more jobs. So I completely agree with Himanshu. So in that sense, whether we do it through manufacturing or services, I think the government is now reconciled to the fact that it has to come through our competitive advantage in relatively less skilled labor that will drive manufacturing, textiles being one example. Right? So that's one transition that we are going through. The other transition that India is going through, I think, the inclusiveness debate, which is absolutely critical for India, and inequality with technology actually increases because technology benefits the people with skills and does not benefit the people with less skills. And that is something that has to be managed in that transition. And that will, of course, depend on the institutional capacity and the ability that we have to effect direct benefit transfers and tax the people who have the ability to pay and make those transfers, create the social infrastructure so that people who are below the poverty line, apart from growth, are also benefited by the social infrastructure that the government is able to contain, to create. And therein, the ability to take from the rich and give to the poor becomes extremely important. The other transition that is happening in India behind all of this is the movement to a kind of a more market-friendly economy from a government kind of driven economy of the past. And this dichotomy or this kind of juxtaposition of the private roles of the private and the public sector are going to be very important in that transition. We are becoming more market friendly, but becoming more market friendly, you need to obviate or preclude the creation of crony capitalism, which is prevalent in many economies, including in India. And for that to happen, as Vivan said, we need to create a very good institutional framework. That capacity to create independent regulation, we can discuss till the cows come home what independent regulation is, but we really do need independent regulation, whether it is by secondment for the private sector to the public sector, by creation, these osmosis or spillover benefits into the public sector, whether it is giving financial autonomy to the regulators. However, but we must create independent regulators and try and preclude political interference in independent commercial decisions by the regulator. Now that's easier said than done. We know, and just to respond to Anil, I've had a lot of experience in the telecom sector in India and on debates on what the role of the public sector and the private sector could be. In India, you have this curious situation where you have an independent regulator, you have a kind of very large public sector that is delivering services, and you have an extremely large and competitive private sector. And there are often complaints that the independent regulator is not independent and really sides with the public sector operator in a number of its decisions. Now, that role has to be made more kind of professional, more arm's length. Privatization may not be the answer in the sense that given the political economy, and that the last point that I will make, given India's political economy, and really the distinction, as I said, between the short term and the long term will be one where that gap can be bridged by creating good capacity so that eventually you may want to privatize or disinvest, but in the short term, that's going to be a politically very difficult decision to take given the job scarcity that we have in India. And lastly, amongst all of this, as we fight the battles for growth, inclusiveness, we also have to fight a battle now for sustainability. So as we grow, we have to ensure that our growth doesn't make the poor even more vulnerable, because remember, climate change and environment doesn't harm the rich. For example, if you were to look at this in an international setting, the United States and Europe could kind of adapt to the new climate much better than countries like India and Bangladesh. Similarly, within a country, the poor are much more vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. And agriculture, which contributes 50% of our livelihoods, is much more vulnerable to climate change than the rich are. And therefore, as we grow and lift millions out of poverty and fight the battle of inclusiveness, we have to fight another battle of climate change and sustainability, and for that we have to also create much more capacity to be able to deal with the situation that is unfolding before us.
Wilfred, we exactly got 2 minutes. So
yeah, okay, I have lots of good points, and I would love to discuss this longer. But I think, see, I'm a German by origin. So Germany is a country that has a percentage of import and export intensity that is probably the highest in the world. So you're pro-free markets, you're pro-trade because if trade collapses, so does Germany. But I think the difference compared to the last 15 years where we had globalization and everybody was getting richer, or quite a few people were getting richer, including in India, is that today we have a big social issue at hand, and that needs to be taken into consideration. I've been in India for 22 years. I've yet to meet a poor person that wants to live by direct transfer. People want to work, they want to be respected, they want exactly the same thing that all of us want, or that the people want in Germany. So I think that is something that we have to really take into consideration, and we have to take it into consideration not only in India. What we're seeing in the United States is a clear, or in Britain, is a sort of gut feel reaction against foreigners, against globalization, against elites. And that gut feel reaction needs to be addressed by what I believe has to be a more balanced approach between free markets and free enterprise, and also the social responsibility of a country, of an organization. And I think that's the challenge going forward.
Thank you. Before our MC butts in, let me thank all of you. Fantastic discussion. Please join me in.
Thank you.